In Afghanistan, the Taliban have executed 13 people from the Hazara ethnic minority group after they had surrendered to the militant group. That's according to an investigation by rights group Amnesty International. A report released on Tuesday says the killings took place on the 30th of August in and near Kahor village in the central province of Daikundi. 11 former members of the Afghan security forces and 2 civilians, including a 17-year-old girl, were among the victims. And joining me for more from Melbourne is Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi. He's a lecturer in international relations at La Trobe University and author of the book, The Hazara and the Afghan State, Rebellion, Exclusion and the Struggle for Recognition. Dr. Ibrahimi, with what is happening to the Hazaras with the Taliban in charge in Afghanistan, do you think the Hazaras are facing ethnic cleansing?
Well, over the past several months now, many people, including international organizations and human rights organizations in Afghanistan, have been raising the alarm of threats of genocide and ethnic cleansing towards the Hazaras in Afghanistan. The Taliban have come to power, and we have seen incidents of targeted attacks increasing on the Hazaras in recent months. And there are also reports of extrajudicial killings coming out from multiple parts of Hazarajat in recent months and weeks.
So if you're a Hazara in Afghanistan now, what really are your options when faced with this reality?
Well, this is an extremely difficult situation for the Hazaras now. The Hazaras don't have any avenues to exercise any influence on the Taliban government. We know from the interim government, they have announced it is an entirely hardline, male and Pashtun-dominated government. The Hazaras don't have any meaningful ways of exercising any influence on the Taliban, either in Kabul or at the subnational level in the Hazara provinces in the central highlands of Afghanistan. And at the same time, in the Hazara provinces of Afghanistan, where the Hazaras are the majority, the local administration is dominated by Pashtun members of the Taliban. So there is an extremely unequal form of relationship that is developing between the Hazaras and the new interim Taliban government, in which the Hazaras have no ways of voicing their concerns or calling for any accountability or any meaningful representation in the new system that is emerging in Afghanistan.
Not a very encouraging picture, unfortunately, but we'll have to leave it there for the time being. But thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi.
Thank you very much for having me.
The change in government in Afghanistan has also brought with it a change in the judicial system, one based on Islamic Sharia law, which the Taliban have yet to define. That means that when it comes to justice in present-day Afghanistan, the Taliban's word is final.
The holding cell of a Kabul police station. The outside is meters away, but worlds away for some detainees subject to the new justice system in Afghanistan. Justice guarded by those trusting in the Taliban interpretation of Islamic law. This detainee is asked, "What is your name and what is your crime?" "I haven't done any crime," he says. The guard replies, "Then after the court hearing, you'll be released." The man seems grateful for the encouraging words. His fellow detainees in the holding cell must wait their turn. Outside, the man is bundled in with a number of other detainees and driven off. These people have committed different crimes. Some of them are murderers. Some are thieves. Some of them were arrested with guns on them, some with knives. And right now they're going to court. Court for many is the office of Judge Shair. He's also a Taliban intelligence officer who says they fought for years and have, with victory, reached this place in order to dispense justice. Any judgment I've made is according to the Sharia law. This is the reason that we've come, and occupation is finished. Islamic scholars have taken the positions of judges. Everything done here is according to Sharia law. Out on the street, uniformed security personnel respond to word of a street fight involving a number of people. They arrest this man, who's now subject to a justice system reliant on what Judge Shair deemed a scholarly view of Islamic law and order. A system that has already seen those found guilty of petty crimes publicly shamed, including the very young. And at least one accused of kidnapping publicly executed and hung for all to see.
Like, there's no law. Our judicial system's gone. And whatever a few men behind closed doors say, that's what you have to do. And if you're gone, you're gone. And we are here.
The Taliban insist there is a strong system being set up, replacing the incessant crime and corruption of Afghanistan's recent past with fairness, order, and Sharia justice.
Meanwhile, a former member of Afghanistan's parliament and prominent women's rights activist Fawzia Koofi has said that a political settlement before a US withdrawal from the country could have averted Taliban rule. She was responding to a question by Tim Sebastian on the DW program Conflict Zone.
You blame the Americans for causing chaos in your country, announcing a pullout before there was any political deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. But there was never going to be any deal on power sharing, was there? So how many more years would you have wanted the US to stay?
Nobody wants a foreign force to be in their country forever. We are a nation that fought for our freedom throughout the history. However, I think the way the withdrawal was managed and resulted the collapse of everything that we have built in the past 20 years could have been avoided. And I still think that if there was more time for a political settlement, instead of investing on withdrawal, if more leverage was used on a political settlement, including a regional consensus, pressurizing those who are actually friends of Taliban, the result would have been different.
Let's get the Afghan perspective on this from a former member of Afghanistan's parliament, Mariam Solaimankhil. Welcome, Ms. Solaimankhil. Does Afghanistan's government, of which you were a part, bear no responsibility for failing to hold the country together?
We need to understand one thing, that it wasn't a collapse, it was but a handover and a surrender by the global community, a surrender of an emerging, vibrant, and prosperous democracy to a Stone Age regime. If the United States hadn't made a deal with the Taliban, completely sidelining the Afghan government, we wouldn't be in the current situation to begin with. The valor and the gallantry of the Afghan soldiers must never be forgotten, and history will remember that hundreds of soldiers sacrificed their lives for peace and security, not just for our country, Afghanistan, but for the security of the whole world.
I'm sorry I'm interrupting. I don't think anybody is doubting the gallantry of the average Afghan soldier, but isn't it a fact that hundreds of thousands of Afghan soldiers also surrendered without a fight, primarily because lots of these soldiers did not want to be seen to be going down to the Taliban for a government that was viewed as corrupt?
I don't think we have all the facts yet. When I was speaking to soldiers on the ground while I was there, they were being told not to fight. We don't know who was telling them not to fight, where this message was coming from, but there's a lot of miscommunication that was happening there. There's no doubt that the government had corruption in it, but I don't think the alternative for the world to stand by a democratic corruption, democratic government was on one side, and then the Taliban was on the other side. Was that the only option? There were financial ways that we could have stopped the corruption and put pressure on our democratic government before handing us over to the Taliban.
But was that pressure being applied to improve and to fight against corruption within the Afghan government?
I don't believe it was being applied as much as it should have. And I don't think the Taliban was the only alternative to a democratic country. Should we start giving away democratic countries that have corruption cases around the world to terrorist organizations that invent a child suicide bomber. That makes no sense to me.
But that is not the case that I'm making, nor is anybody else making. People are just trying to raise the fact that corruption was endemic in the Afghan government, and potentially that had an impact. And I'd just like to sort of quote, these are not my words. These are the words of John F. Sopko, who is the head of the U.S. watchdog that was overseeing U.S. reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. And he just said in a radio interview, and I quote, "The Afghan government did not take an active response to our criticism on corruption. Ultimately, it contributed to the Taliban's success. People saw how corrupt and incompetent their government was, so they lost respect for the government and support for the government." Would you agree with that assessment?
I agree. I think there was a lot of corruption, and I agree that the government could have done more to clean up corruption. But I don't agree that the global community and the world decided our fate with no discussion with the Afghan government whatsoever. No discussion with our women. We haven't had education for women now for over 15 days, for over 2 weeks, and I don't think this was fair whatsoever. I think more could have done by the global community to put pressure on a democratic system. We could have gotten rid of our president. We could have had another elections. We could have brought in any other option but the Taliban.
But just to focus on the government, because the government was democratically elected, it had been there for 20 years, not the same government, of course. And we're talking about, let's just look at the numbers. You're talking about something like 300,000 Afghan soldiers versus some 70,000 Taliban. And as I just mentioned, the US assessment is that the Afghan government was corrupt, and therefore soldiers thought it wasn't worth supporting. Is it not the responsibility of the Afghan government to inspire that confidence in its soldiers and its people that we are worth supporting, and therefore to put up a fight?
I think what happened at the end, no one could have predicted or expected, and it's not something that I expected or predicted to happen. It's absolutely heartbreaking, the way that the whole world abandoned us. I don't think anyone expected, we still are in shock over it.
Is the Afghan government at fault?
They share responsibility. But I think for the crisis, I think this was a global issue. I think the whole world abandoned us. I don't think it was just the Afghan government.
Just one final question to you, ma'am. You are personally related to former President Ashraf Ghani as well. Do you think you could have done more in your personal and professional capacity to help root out corruption in the government?
I wish I could have. He is a distant relative of mine, but I never expected this. And I still don't believe that he himself stole money from the country or was involved in corruption the way he was. I think the people around him were. I think what brought us down were the people around him. And I think he's probably still absorbing what happened. I don't think anyone could believe we got to where we are now.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us today. Former member of Afghan Parliament, Mariam Solaimankhil. Thousands fled Afghanistan to escape to countries in Europe that would take them in. Among them is Rateb Nouri, a journalist who's building a new life in France. And he's found a warm welcome at a Parisian bar. That's a gathering spot for others who've been forced to start over.
Rateb Nouri looks right at home in the streets of Paris. But the journalist only arrived in France for the first time in late August, after fleeing the Afghan capital, Kabul. He headed the Kabul bureau for Radio Free Europe and worked for a French news agency, making him a target for the Taliban. He arrived in Paris with his wife Sarah, who's pregnant. Her family is still in Kabul and she doesn't want to be identified on camera.
We actually stepped down to Paris airport. And we both started crying because, it was a mixed feeling. And we were like, okay, now what? We're safe. But again, you are uprooted, leaving everything behind. Your roots, your culture, your families, your relations, your relatives. Oh, ça va, Jack?
Being in exile is new for Rateb. But he's found a place in Paris, the Dissident Club, which welcomes people like him.
How are you? Good, how are you? Good.
It's run by Taha Siddique, a Pakistani journalist.
The Dissident Club basically provides a platform for people in exile who want to continue their activism in exile, connect them with each other, learn from each other's experiences, and also build a bridge between each other and the French society.
Taha also had to leave his country. In 2018, the journalist who is critical of Pakistan's powerful army escaped armed men who tried to kidnap him in the capital, Islamabad. Taha came to Paris and became a political exile. Last year, he set up the refugee bar, reviving a Parisian tradition.
In Paris, I mean, from what I learned since I've arrived here, that this was the idea of the bars, this was the idea of the cafes, that people would come together and discuss and you know, focus on issues.
The bar hosts weekly events on political issues around the world. Tonight, there's a talk on conflict and peace resolution.
Welcome everyone to the Dissident Club.
There are voices from Rwanda and Colombia, also a reporter back from Syria. Rateb is also one of the speakers tonight.
So basically, everybody was surprised with the takeover of the Taliban because we were not really thinking that it will be very quick and swift.
With the event over, Rateb is relieved. He says speaking about his experiences here tonight has helped lighten his burden.
I think it was one of the best experiences so far that I have been in Paris because I learned a lot from those people, and I think I made very good new contacts. I talk out a lot. As much as I speak, it gets easier for me, and I think I could be sleeping well tonight.
A peaceful night. Given the situation back in his country, Rateb hasn't had many of those since he arrived in Paris. Like him, thousands of newly arrived Afghans in France will have to reinvent their lives.